Hey everyone, it's Mr. Drake. We have gone over the beginning of the Renaissance and how it flowered in Italy and in Southern Europe, and today we're going to talk a little bit about the Northern Renaissance. So, by the end of this video, what you should be able to do is identify the areas where the Renaissance took off outside of Italy, countries like Germany, England, Spain, France, the Netherlands, Belgium, those northern and western European countries. You should be able to describe what these writers and artists did and what they accomplished. Dürer, Erasmus, Thomas More, Shakespeare, and Cervantes. And explain about the printing press and why it was so important, why the printing press invented by Johann Gutenberg was such an important invention. So here are some of the important artists of the Northern Renaissance. There was a very famous German artist named Albrecht Dürer, and his preferred medium of painting was not really even painting, it was called engraving. And what he would do is he would take a piece of metal, a flat piece of metal, and he would use acid to etch lines onto that piece of metal, and he would put those lines together, and it would end up making a drawing or a depiction of something. And then he would take that engraved piece of metal and he would use that with ink to make prints on paper of the work that he had etched. If you go back to the very beginning of this video, the picture in the background on the introductory slide is actually a Dürer engraving. You can even see his initials AD up at the top left. There were also a lot of painters in Western Europe, in the Netherlands, and in an area called Flanders, which is sort of what is now Belgium. People from the Netherlands are called Dutch, and people from Flanders are called Flemish. One very famous painter is Jan Vermeer. He is best known for a painting called Girl with a Pearl Earring, which you see there on top on the right. That was actually made into a movie a few years ago with Scarlett Johansson playing the girl depicted in the painting. The movie was just called Girl with a Pearl Earring, and if you look at that painting, she actually does kind of look like Scarlett Johansson, so there you go. Also, Peter Bruegel. He was very well known for painting scenes of just average, everyday life. He didn't paint religious figures much. He didn't do a lot of portraits of individual people, but he did do a lot of paintings of just people going about their daily business. And the bottom painting there is an example that's simply called the Peasant Dance, sort of a street party, you could say, in Flanders. So those are some very important artists that you should know about for the Northern Renaissance. Humanism was something that started in Italy. We talked about that. It was that philosophy that people should be well educated in the classical sense, that they should use Greek and Roman texts to learn things, and that people should be well educated. This was used to bring about moral reform in a lot of cases. And again, we talked about Italian humanism a little bit, but it really took hold in the Northern Renaissance. Erasmus was a Dutch humanist. His picture is on top. He is best known for a book called The Praise of Folly. Folly is, something that is erroneous or incorrect or something that is wrong or immoral. And it was a funny story, but it criticizes people for behaving immorally, including priests and the clergy, which he saw as being hypocritical and very corrupt at that time. Thomas More is from England, and he was one of the advisors to King Henry VIII, whom we'll talk about later in this unit. But his most famous work is called Utopia, and it's about a fictional country on an island where men and women are essentially equal, and there is no crime, and everything is just sort of perfect. And to this day, the word utopia is used to describe a perfect society, or something that is utopian. It is said to be, perfect and harmonious and wonderful and free of conflict. So they're very important. Make sure you know about them. There were a lot of famous authors of the Northern Renaissance who wrote works for pleasure, not humanists. They wrote sort of in a philosophical sense. These were more for entertainment. A lot of Italian writers wrote stuff in Latin, which was sort of the old language, obviously, of ancient Rome, Whereas in the Northern Renaissance, a lot of stories and books were written in the vernacular, and what that means is the local language, so that everybody could understand it. Not a lot of people knew Latin, but if you wrote something in English, most people spoke that. Obviously, any discussion of all this in the Northern Renaissance must include William Shakespeare, the most famous playwright of all time, England's most famous writer ever. He wrote something around 38 plays, about 154 sonnets, which are 14-line poems, and he wrote 2 long narrative poems, too. And Shakespeare introduced words into the English language that had never been used before. Words like bedroom, hurry, sneak, S-N-E-A-K, generous. Those are all words that Shakespeare invented. And also, there are a lot of famous quotes or lines from his plays that have sort of crept into popular culture to this day. For example, from the play As You Like It, all the world's a stage and all the men and women merely players. Very famous line you hear every once in a while. To be or not to be, that is the question. It's a quote from Shakespeare's play Hamlet. So he has a huge impact. He wrote all different kinds of plays too. He wrote tragedies, he wrote comedies, and he also wrote histories, which were just sort of like accounts of historical events. One famous one is Julius Caesar, which depicts the assassination of Julius Caesar in 44 BC on the Ides of March, which hopefully you remember. In Spain, the most famous writer is Miguel de Cervantes, who wrote a book in 1605 called Don Quixote, which sort of makes fun of medieval chivalry and the idea of knights and this code of honor and all of that. The basic introduction to the plot of Don Quixote is this man reads all these books about medieval life and the nobility, and he sort of becomes obsessed with it, and he decides he wants to become a knight in search of an adventure. So he dons a old coat of armor. He goes out on his skinny, scrawny, malnourished horse, which he had renamed Rocinante because it sounded very majestic. He got a sidekick named Sancho Panza, who rode a little donkey around, I guess, and they would go off in search of adventure. And one of the most famous things he would do, Don Quixote, was fight windmills, which he sort of, in his crazy, altered state of mind, thought were these big, ferocious giants. And that's sort of what that picture there at the right is depicting. And you will hear sometimes people will say you're fighting windmills or something. That means you're fighting against something that's just, it's pointless to fight against. I think the actual phrase in England usually is tilting at windmills, referring to like jousting if you tilt against someone. So those are 2 very famous, important writers of the Northern Renaissance. Make sure you know what they accomplished. Now, part of what made all of those works of literature so famous was the printing press. Before the printing press, before movable type, books were often copied by, oftentimes you may remember, monks in monasteries. And it was very difficult, it was very time consuming, and you don't have a lot of books out there because there's only so many, copies of books you can do by hand. But what Gutenberg invented in Europe was movable type, where you take individual little metal letters and you move them around on a slab, and you put them in the order that would create the words that you want to print, and then you use that slab of these metal letters to print out what you want to publish. And the first book he made in 1456 was the Bible, and it's referred to as the Gutenberg Bible, and there's still some copies of it that exist. Of course, the advancement of books was also made much easier by the introduction of paper to Europe. Paper had sort of been introduced into Europe from China about 200 years before Gutenberg came along. But because of the printing press, books became much easier to produce. And as a result, there were more books. And as a result of that, they were cheaper. So more people had access to books, and as a result, people wanted to learn to read so that they could know what those books actually said. And Europeans became exposed to ideas in arts and sciences and just this, these wonderful fictional stories that they never would have been exposed to before the invention of movable type. So Gutenberg's invention is usually, when you look at a list of like the most important inventions in history, Gutenberg's printing press is always at the top, if not, at least the top 10 or so. So very important. Make sure you know about Gutenberg's printing press and what it led to, what it accomplished. Well, that will do it for today's video. As always, keep up with all your assignments and ask your teachers if you have any questions. Cheers.